Hello and welcome to another video from Sustenance and Cover, the only channel that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy it. And today's video is going to be What's This Bible All About Part 3. Yahweh makes His first law known to all. In my first two Bible videos I explained that the Creator's first law was that all humans were to spread out evenly over the earth's landmass and care for all of the planet's living things. Even though most people chose instead to gather in small population centers and exploit the planet's resources, as well as one another, some did choose to try their very best to follow God's first law. And many native peoples around the world over the centuries have left ample evidence that this lifestyle is not only possible, but much better than that afforded by so-called civilization. Many people are familiar with the North American spiritual leader known as Sitting Bull of the Lakota and the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The reason for this is that whenever an empire decides to enslave an indigenous people and consume all of their resources, it usually goes off without a hitch. That's not what happened at the Little Bighorn. The empire had killed all of these people's animals, cut down all of their trees, and burned all of their crops, and even hunted them down for sport. And yet this simple people was able to win a great victory against the Anglo-American Empire with little more than the tools that they used to hunt and gather their food. But this was nothing more than a fluke. And this event did little more than give the North American genocide even more momentum. These indigenous people who dared to stand in the way of progress had to quickly be brought to an extinction. Those who were not enslaved and assimilated were incarcerated, and those not incarcerated were exterminated, just as had been done to hundreds of other indigenous cultures by the Anglo-American Empire as well as the previous 6 human empires mentioned in the Bible. It has been over a century now, and for the most part the offspring of the survivors who have chosen to maintain their integrity and reject the slavery-based system known as civilization are still little more than prisoners. But the Creator remembers every single thing that was done to this holy people, and justice will be forthcoming. Now, as incredible as this incident was, it was nothing compared to an incident that took place over 3,000 years earlier. Another group of indigenous people, much like the Lakota, had spent 40 years crossing the desert with none of the material resources or infrastructure of the surrounding civilizations. This indigenous people was about to attack a great walled city called Jericho. This wasn't going to be a sneak attack. In fact, there was to be no surprise involved at all because the entire world knew that the Creator had set this land aside for a people that He would choose, not just for whatever civilization had the greater military force. This land was not going to be stripped and turned into a wasteland by human civilization, but was to remain a land flowing with milk and honey, so that all the world could see the results of rulership by God compared with the results of rulership by man. Now you might think that if it was common knowledge that the Creator was going to kill everybody who stood in the way of His purpose, they would have changed their ways or at least ran and hid. But as the Bible explains, all human governments are directly controlled by demons, and the demons that were worshipped in Jericho were apparently not all that concerned about the welfare of their worshipers. Instead of just telling you that all human governments are controlled by demons, I'm going to show you how to find this information in your own Bible. And really, you shouldn't just take my word for it anyway, because that's how Christianity got so messed up in the first place, by people just taking somebody's word for something instead of reading it for themselves. Now, just in case you're not that familiar with the Bible, I'm going to explain some very basic principles about it that will make it more user-friendly for you. The Bible that we have today is not in the original languages in which it was written. This shouldn't surprise anyone, since I'm pretty sure everybody already knew that. In fact, simply owning any of those original language books of the Bible was a state crime punishable by death under the laws of both the Roman as well as the Anglo-American empires. And I doubt that there's anyone who would debate me on that fact either. These are just historic facts that pretty much everybody knows. The reason that human governments hate those trying to follow the Creator's first law is because all empires demand compliance and obedience. In the Bible, this is known as devotion. And the kind of devotion that empires want is called total devotion. So Rome spent nearly 300 years arresting, torturing, and executing those who possessed books of the Bible, as well as anyone who attempted to live by the basic precepts of the Bible, especially God's first law, because the original language Bibles required devotion not to the state, but to the Creator. In fact, in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 15, God says that human governments are not even worth His consideration. To the oligarchs of Rome, this simply would not do. Finally, the emperor realized that it would be much more efficient to simply assimilate Christ's followers into Roman society, because the arrests, tortures, and executions simply weren't working. This assimilation reached its peak when in the late 4th century, the Roman state published its own version of the Bible known as the Versio Vulgata. And as one might have already figured out, all the scriptures that shed light on God's hatred of human governments were altered in such a way that not only was devotion to the state made to appear acceptable to God, but it even altered the words of the Bible just enough to make it seem that God's spiritual representative on earth was the emperor of Rome himself. But as they say, all good things must come to an end, and Rome eventually collapsed as the previous 5 empires mentioned in the Bible had collapsed before it. And the world entered a period from around the 6th to the 13th century known as the Dark Ages. At the end of this period, the small nation of England began to rise to power, and in the course of time became the Bible's 7th world power, which we now know as the Anglo-American Empire. That's us. As I said earlier, all empires demand devotion, and the Anglo-American Empire proved to be no different. Just as in Rome, England initiated a policy of arresting, torturing, and executing anyone found possessing a Bible, or even anyone attempting to live by its basic precepts. As had happened previously in the Roman Empire, no matter how many Christians were killed, more would take their place. So the King of England eventually came to the same realization that Rome had, and decided that assimilation would simply be a more efficient way of controlling the Christian population. Noting the success of the Roman Bible, which was still being used to keep the majority of Europe in subjection, the English government began publishing its own versions of the Bible beginning in 1541, with the final one being completed in 1611. And once again, all scriptures pertaining to exclusive devotion to God were altered to make it seem like devotion to God would actually require devotion to the empire. This altering of the ancient text for the British Empire's version of the Bible allowed for a policy which has come to be known as divine right of kings, meaning once again that the leader of the empire would also be the defender of the faith, or to put it another way, God's spiritual leader on the earth. Now what I'm about to tell you isn't going to be all that involved or hard to follow. We'll just be looking at one word for the most part, because this one word can shine some light on literally hundreds of scriptures about how the Creator feels about human governments. That word is Gentile. The definition of the word Gentile is simply non-Jew. This word is nothing more than a racial slur and is not found in any ancient manuscript of any book of the Bible. Remember, the Bibles that we have today claim to be translated directly from the ancient text that I'm talking about. That being the case, our modern Bibles should not have any words in them that don't appear in the ancient Bibles that they were supposedly translated from. In what is called the Old Testament, Gentile is translated from the Hebrew word goy. And in what is called the New Testament, it is translated from the Greek word ethnos. These words can only be translated as the singular or plural forms of the word nation, and can also be used to speak of the people of a nation. No matter how a person might try to twist the Creator's words as found in the ancient text, there is simply no way that either of these words could ever be translated as Gentile, or as I said earlier, non-Jew. In fact, both of the words that I just mentioned are used throughout the Bible to describe both Jews and non-Jews. Sometimes when the Bible is speaking of a nation, it's speaking of one of the so-called civilized nations. But other times it's speaking of the nation that the Creator chose to separate from civilization. There's no reason for the words goy or ethnos to be translated differently depending on who is being spoken of. To literally translate these words as nation will allow anyone willing to read to figure out for themselves which nation. Here are some examples of occasions in the Bible where the words goy and ethnos are used. Exodus 19:6 says, "And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and an holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel." That phrase, holy nation, is accurately translated from the Hebrew words goy kadosh, literally nation holy. And from reading this passage accurately translated, anybody would understand exactly what was meant. The people being addressed who walked away from Egyptian civilization in order to follow God's first law would be a holy nation. Pretty self-explanatory. Now pay attention to the next scripture that I'm going to read, which is Jeremiah chapter 46 and verse 1. It reads like this. "The word of the Lord, which came to Jeremiah the prophet against the Gentiles." Now, as we said, the word Gentiles is supposed to mean non-Jews. Remember, the Hebrew word being translated here is goy. The same word that was translated as nation in the previous Bible verse is now translated as non-Jew. Why would this word be translated in an entirely different way at this particular scripture? We can't reasonably go back and translate the scripture at Exodus as saying holy Gentile or holy non-Jew. The scripture wouldn't make any sense. God was addressing the Jews when He said it. But it's quite reasonable to translate this scripture as saying the word of the Lord which came to Jeremiah the prophet against the nations. The same way that it was translated as nation in the scripture at Exodus. It would have easily been understood that the nations spoken of here would have been the human nations ruled by human kings that surrounded Yahweh's holy nation, which was ruled directly by the Creator. At this point in history, Israel had not yet rebelled against Yahweh by demanding a human king. By mistranslating the Hebrew word goy to the English word Gentile, the kings of England were able to accomplish two things. First, they made the Creator of all shapes, sizes, colors, and styles of human beings appear to be a racist. A really good thing to do if you want to enslave, incarcerate, and exterminate human beings that are not the same color as you, or speak the same language as you, or live in the same area of the planet as you. To the kings of England, this was a very important part of their agenda. Another thing that they were able to accomplish by having this one word mistranslated was to cover over how the Creator felt about human governments. No king of any nation would voluntarily publish information like that. This word nation is translated and mistranslated hundreds of times in hundreds of different English versions of the Bible. And it would take days to look up each occurrence of the word, but just know this. Every time that the passage sheds light on Yahweh's hatred of human nations, the word is mistranslated to make it seem that God really just hates non-Jews. Here's one more scripture that shows even more forcefully just how much and why God hates the national groups of mankind. It's found at 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 20 and reads like this in the British Empire's version of the Bible. But I say that the things which the nations, or the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. And I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils. This time, Gentiles is translated from the Greek word ethnos. This is the Greek word for nations. The various Bibles of the empire often mistranslate ethnos into other words. But once again, the only accurate way to consistently translate this word into English is to always translate it as nations. A more accurate way that I have seen this scripture translated is this: the things that the nations sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons. I'm not the first person to question why this word is translated to make it seem like all non-Jews worship demons. 1 Corinthians was written in 55 AD. When Paul wrote this statement, the decision to accept non-Jews into the congregations had already been made nearly 20 years earlier. To address this problem, the empire released several more versions of the Bible, changing this word to be either pagans or heathens. This change shows that the empire recognized that the Greek word ethnos could not possibly mean non-Jews, but still refused to accurately translate it as nations. By mistranslating this word as heathen or pagan, it made it seem that God didn't hate the human nations, but instead hated everyone that was not a member of one of the human nations' legally recognized religions. I've even found several Bibles that consistently translate the word ethnos as nations as long as it doesn't offend the empire, but then simply remove it from the Bible altogether any time that it does. How can any Bible translator in good conscience just arbitrarily decide on his own to remove part of the Creator's life-saving teachings? I highly recommend that anyone who is interested in any way in what I'm saying simply to go online to Strong's Exhaustive Concordance. Strong's is an alphabetical list of every single word in the King James Bible. It's been around since 1890, and if there were any mistakes, I'm sure that they would have been uncovered by now. The words you want to look up are goy, which is Strong's reference number 1471, and ethnos, number 1481. Or you could just simply type in the word Gentile in Strong's search box. The only reason that the Anglo-American Empire would feel the need to mistranslate the word nation in so many different ways is to deceive those trying to serve God into believing that the false religions of nationalism and patriotism are part of true worship. If you feel that I'm wrong and that there is some other reasonable explanation as to why these two ancient words would need to be translated in so many different ways, let me know. I'm pretty open-minded. Another thing that you can do just to confirm what I'm saying is to simply Google 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 20. There are many translations of ancient Bible manuscripts available online, and you will find each and every way of translating these words that I told you about right there on your computer screen. So why did Yahweh decide to destroy Jericho? For the very same reason that he had been destroying human civilizations for thousands of years. Human kingdoms stand in direct opposition to God's kingdom. Human nations simply cannot exist in a natural world where people follow God's first law. Quite a few people have told me that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed not because they were civilizations, but because of sexual immorality. And there can't be no doubt that the citizens of Sodom were sexually depraved. After all, even today, civilizations breed sexually depraved people, but there's no reason to think that this was the only sin of Sodom that God was concerned with. I've also been told that the reason that God destroyed Jericho is because they weren't Jews, and only Jews have the right to live in Israel. In fact, this is the reason that the Anglo-American Empire gives for the military campaigns against the indigenous peoples of Palestine today. Let's look and see if any of this is true. In Jericho, there was a woman who wanted to follow God's first law. but could not leave Jericho in order to do so, because she was not aware of anywhere else to go. Like many of us today, it would have disgusted her to have to live among those who saw racism, injustice, oppression, greed, militarism, and consumerism as not only acceptable, but honorable, and good for the economy, so to speak. And when she learned that there was a people coming across the desert that were completely unaffected by civilization, she may have thought that the stories of these people were nothing but myths. She might have contemplated running away from the city to see if they would allow her to join them, but figured that if the stories run true, her situation may have just gotten worse. Can you imagine how she must have felt when she actually met two of these people, and when she asked if she could join them, they said yes? How wonderful that must have felt. The city of Jericho was destroyed, and this is how it happened. Excuse me. The people of Israel marched around the city for 6 days blowing horns. At the end of that time, they all cried out, and the walls of Jericho fell. Only ancient Israel has ever attempted such a maneuver. Even today, when one of mankind's nations decides to attack some other nation, they never just trust in God to miraculously destroy their enemy's walls. Instead, they put their trust in nuclear ballistic missiles, stealth attack drones, depleted uranium projectiles, aircraft carriers, and a host of other genocidal weapons of mass destruction. Before the nation of Israel stopped to divide up the land, they destroyed 30 more cities. Each time, the Creator intervened in some kind of miraculous way so that His people would know that it wasn't by military might that they were cleansing the land. In fact, Israel, by law, was not allowed to engage in any of civilization's disgusting things, and that was to include warfare. As the Creator put it, they were only a tool that He was using to cleanse His holy land. They would not be allowed to fight against anyone unless directly ordered by God to do so, and not outside of the boundaries of the Promised Land. Those that created the wastelands of civilization were welcome to stay there unmolested. As long as they stayed outside of the boundaries of God's holy nation, they could continue to exist as sovereign entities all the way up until the great day of God the Almighty, when they would all be exterminated as one. Of course, anyone wishing to follow God's law and live sustainably was allowed, or was always welcome to enter the Promised Land and do so, just as Rahab had. But from now on, every nation on the earth was going to know, without a doubt, the consequences of not obeying God's first law, which in a fear-inspiring way had been made known to all mankind. Now, is it possible that all of those 30 nations, as well as Jericho, Egypt, Sodom, Gomorrah, and Babel, as well as all those civilizations destroyed by the flood, were destroyed simply because their citizens did not possess Jewish DNA? As the Creator, wouldn't it have been easier to simply not create all those non-Jews in the first place? Did He destroy them because they were sexually immoral? Just the story of Rahab disproves both of them theories. You see, Rahab was a prostitute, and she wasn't a Jew. But apparently that didn't bother the Creator too much. In fact, He loved Rahab so much that He had 2 Israelite men sent to Jericho just to save her and bring her into the nation of Israel so that she could become one of Jesus' ancestresses. The Apostle Paul called Rahab the prostitute an example of faith set before all Christians. And when James was telling people that faith without works is dead, he specifically mentioned Rahab the prostitute as someone who proved her faith by hiding those who were going to destroy her city. The patriots of Jericho would have called her a traitor and a whore. Everybody that has ever tried to convince me of how wonderful their particular church is has set before me an example of somebody that they personally know, sometimes even themselves, that because of their church was able to give up drinking, sexual immorality, drugs, and cussing, and become productive members of society. Well, according to the Bible, that ain't exactly what you call making progress. In fact, if anything, that would be what you call backsliding. It is quite literally impossible to be what is considered a productive member of human society without actively and aggressively breaking God's first law. Fortunately, there are many examples of those who live within God-dishonoring civilizations similar to our own situation today that were able to maintain their relationship with the Creator. We'll find out more about that in What's This Bible All About? Part 4, Doing God's Will Within a Wicked Society. If you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.